energética. Transparencia en la información ambiental en el sector extractivo.
Gestión y gobernanza de recursos naturales a nivel subnacional.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this fourth session of this webinar series called Good Practices and Trends in the Extractive Industry. Thank you very much for your attendance in the more than 20 countries that are already connected. And today's topic is at the very heart of the EITI discussions regarding systematic disclosure, open data, and most important of that, how to use effectively the data given the great quantity of initiatives and regulations that are already in place. I am very pleased to welcome today our panelists, as usual, a very good level panelist. Thank you very much for your time. First, say good morning to Ms. Carolina Rojas, Vice Minister Carolina, good morning. Welcome again to this webinar series, and thank you very much for attending. Well, Carolina is today's Vice Minister of Mines in Colombia. She has several years of experience working both in the multilateral institutions, such as the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. And she has also been the Vice President of the Colombian Mining Agency. And other public institutions such as the Finance Ministry in Colombia. Thank you for being with us, Vice Minister, and welcome.
Thank you.
Also, we have, and I'd like to welcome Erika Westenberg. Erika is the leader for NRGI's portfolio on research, technical assistance, capacity development and advocacy on government and private sector policies, and public oversight mechanisms. Erika is a lawyer, graduated from Harvard, and has some other titles from the London School of Economics and the government from the Harvard College. She's a board member of the EITI since 2019. As the Vice Minister Rojas is the same. Erika, good morning in the United States, and welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And finally, also good afternoon in England to Mr. Michael Nash. Michael has worked at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy of the United Kingdom since 1984. A good year. She has worked on various areas of the department, including overseas trade, parliamentary branch, and finance. And since 2016, Mike has worked in the United Kingdom Secretariat for the EITI and has been in charge of the implementation of the new UK EITI website, the appointment of the independent administrator, and how to address the validation comments that the United Kingdom has received as part of their EITI process. As it was the situation for the previous webinars, the structure is the same. We will have three presentations from each panelist. This panelist will take between 15 and 20 minutes to present their thoughts. And finally, we will have more or less 30 minutes to a Q&A session. So please feel free to send your questions through the platform, and we will try to address and answer as many as possible. We will start as usual with this introductory video, and we will be back for the discussions. So please, in the technical desk, if you can help me with the video, thank you very much.
Mainstreaming, avances y desafíos. Las tendencias en transparencia y buen gobierno se han constituido en estándares mínimos sobre la accesibilidad a datos en la gestión de los recursos públicos y en la relación del Estado con sus ciudadanos. Existe gran cantidad de iniciativas que buscan mejorar la calidad de estas discusiones, a la vez que los gobiernos responden de diferente manera a estas tendencias. Ante la proliferación de iniciativas y normativas, vale la pena revisar cómo se complementan y cómo aprovechar los avances logrados. La integración de sistemas de gobierno e iniciativas se convierte en una necesidad para asegurar que los avances logrados sean sostenibles, utilizados en la gestión pública y se constituyan en herramientas valiosas para la formulación de políticas públicas. EIT no es ajena a esta necesidad y bajo el concepto de mainstreaming busca integrarse en otros sistemas de gobierno para mejorar sus impactos e influencias sobre la gestión de los recursos extractivos en los países en donde se implementa. Conozcamos experiencias de los países en su búsqueda por integrar las discusiones de la EIT, el desarrollo y los desafíos por abordar. ¿Qué estrategias han adoptado los países para ampliar el alcance de las iniciativas que implementan? ¿Qué logros se han alcanzado hasta ahora y qué desafíos quedan por abordar? ¿Cómo se han utilizado los datos generados por EIT en las discusiones sobre políticas públicas y desarrollo? Con el apoyo de Cooperación Alemana, GIZ, EIT Colombia, EIT Perú.
So, thank you very much. And we will start with Erica's presentation to give us a general overview and international overview. And then we will come back with Vice Minister Rojas and Michael Nash presentations to give us two country cases in Colombia and the United Kingdom. So, Erica, welcome again. And please, thank you very much. Yes, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and hopefully you'll be able to see my slides. First, I'd like to just start by thanking the organizers for the chance to join this discussion today. Just a brief word about my organization. NRGI is an independent analysis and advocacy institute. We work globally and in around a dozen countries, including Colombia, Mexico, and Peru in Latin America. And our mission is for countries rich in oil, gas, and minerals to achieve sustainable, inclusive development, and for people to receive lasting benefits from extractives and experience reduced harms. NRGI has also been involved in the EITI since the initiative's inception, really, and we're one of the core partners supporting EITI engagement globally and in countries where we work. So really pleased to be able to talk about mainstreaming today. If I could have the next slide, please. So first, I just wanted to start with saying a few words around making sure we're on the same page in terms of what we're talking about when we say mainstreaming. It's kind of an unusual word, and I know today we've decided to not even try to translate it into Spanish. That's how unusual a word it is. So I think it's important to make sure we kind of talk about the terminology. So first, obviously, we can look to the EITI standard, and what the EITI standard says is that first, in terms of terminology, systematic disclosure and mainstreaming are used interchangeably. So you'll often hear people refer to both, the same concept. And the concept refers to meeting EITI disclosure requirements through routine, publicly available company and government reporting. I'd put it slightly differently. I'd say it's about integrating EITI's transparency and consultation best practices into the day-to-day operations and systems of government agencies and companies. So to me, it's about shifting the goal from being about producing an EITI report once a year to being about regularizing transparency and consultation as part of the way, as part of the DNA of how government agencies and companies operate. If I could have the next slide, please. So why does this shift matter? Why so much attention on mainstreaming? I think shifting from annual standalone reports towards this more integrated ongoing transparency matters because it increases the likelihood that EITI will meet its core objective. I consider EITI's core objective to be best distilled in the EITI principles, which really haven't changed since the initiative's founding. And in this EITI Principle 4, which is quoted on this slide, to me, it's clear that the objective is for the disclosure of information about what's happening in the sector to help facilitate public debate and inform sound policy choices for achieving sustainable development. And we know that public debates and policy choices about pressing issues in the sector don't happen once a year. They happen all the time. They're dynamic, they change. So in order for data to be useful to informing those debates and informing those policy choices, the disclosures can't just be once a year. They have to be ongoing, and to do that, again, transparency norms and engagement that facilitates debate has to be integrated into the way entities work. So I really think it's important in terms of framing this issue that mainstreaming is not just a sort of technically preferable thing as a matter of data standards. It's really something that matters in terms of the EITI's potential for accountability, sustainability, and longer term impact. If I could have the next slide, please. Just briefly, I'll cover what the 2019 EITI standard requires, what it says about mainstreaming. First, and importantly, it's that systematic disclosure or mainstreaming is the expectation now, and that's a really important shift. I'll talk in the next slide a little bit of kind of how the EITI standard has evolved on this. And it talks about how EITI reports still have a critical role to play in terms of providing additional context, collating various sources that might be used in a mainstreamed approach and addressing any gaps or concerns around data quality. The standard talks about explicitly referencing publicly available information as a viable way of meeting EITI disclosure requirements. Another important element in the standard is that MSG work plans now must address what the plans are for engaging on systematic disclosures and mainstreaming. And practically, that's a really important step. And then finally, there's an encouragement in the standard around MSGs making systematically disclosed data machine readable, interoperable, to code and tag the data in a way that makes it comparable. And again, that really goes to this data use and integration point of mainstreaming. If I could have the next slide, please. So like I mentioned, there's kind of been this evolution in recent years of essentially the same goal around mainstreaming. In 2013, the EITI standard phrasing for a lot of requirements was the EITI report must describe. So a very kind of standard traditional concept that all of the information is going to be in this kind of book, this EITI report. In 2016, we transitioned to the MSG must disclose, so kind of a more open-ended framing of the concept that it might not necessarily, every piece of data might not be in the EITI report, but the MSG is still responsible for disclosing this information. And in the 2019 standard, what we see is the further evolution now that disclosure through routine government and corporate reporting is an expected and valued approach. So that's kind of the furthest iteration of this, if you will, that it's not just about the EITI report, it's not just about the MSG undertaking this disclosure activity, it's this deeper, more holistic concept of disclosures being routine through government and company entities. If I could have the next slide, please. So I want to talk about a few misconceptions that I think are pretty frequent around this concept of mainstreaming. One of them is around EITI portals or EITI websites, data websites. I want to be clear, EITI portals can be very valuable, but it matters in terms of the process by which they are created. If it's a process where the main primary responsibility for collecting information and publishing information is still on the multi-stakeholder group, then it's not really the most deeply integrated mainstreamed approach that I think we're conceptualizing. It's more an EITI website. So instead of a hard copy EITI report, you have an electronic EITI report that is a website. Certainly EITI portals can be a critical tool in mainstreaming if there are integrated disclosures happening elsewhere through government agencies and company reporting, and the EITI portal is a landing page to access those various disclosures and to analyze those disclosures. So I don't want to say that there isn't a critical role for them, but it does matter the nature of them. Too often we see the idea that if you have an EITI website, somehow you've mainstreamed, and that's not exactly it. I think a second common misconception is that mainstreaming is just about revenues or just about quantitative data. I'll try to talk through some examples today that demonstrate why that's not the case, but I think it's a really, really critical point that EITI requirements around licensing round transparency can be just as important to mainstream as around revenue data. And the last common misconception that I want to mention is just that mainstreaming does not have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be, there are hundreds of disclosure requirements in the EITI standard. Companies do not have to mainstream all of them at once. In fact, I think the best approach is prioritizing mainstreaming around areas where you have existing good integrated data and not too heavy a lift, or where they're just pressing policy concerns or questions or risks, and that's where you want to focus a more integrated approach. So certainly can be piecemeal and does not need to be the entire EITI standard all at once. So just wanted to mention that briefly. If I could have the next slide, please. I'll take a minute to talk about kind of what's been driving this momentum around mainstreaming. I already mentioned some of the limitations of conventional reports. They're not well integrated with ongoing policymaking and public debate processes, so they're often not used as much as they should be. Another key driver has definitely been costs, and we know that budgets are tighter now than ever before. Producing standalone EITI reports can be expensive. Hiring an independent administrator to collect and reconcile data is expensive. There is also often the sense that once an independent administrator is involved, the MSG sometimes loses a degree of ownership or control over the process, and that it can become very kind of consultant heavy and largely outsourced. Ultimately, sometimes members of MSG feel somewhat disconnected from the process that they should really be driving and shaping and leveraging nationally. And I think related to that has been a desire by some MSGs to have their role evolve into something that feels less administrative, less about hiring contractors and developing templates, and instead being more substantive, having more bandwidth to analyze data and actually consider policy implications. So I think those are some long-standing motivations for the shift to mainstreaming. I want to spend a little time talking about two new motivations, and those are the COVID-19 pandemic and energy transition considerations. If I could please have the next slide. So in May, in recognition of the obviously huge challenges associated with the pandemic, the EITI board agreed measures to give implementing countries the option to pursue flexible EITI reporting. At the moment, 9 countries are pursuing flexible reporting, including Argentina and Honduras, and I hope more countries will consider it. Flexible reporting will entail countries preparing disclosures covering their latest reporting year, that's typically 2018 or 2019, in addition to disclosing more up-to-date information and analysis on the impact of COVID-19 on the sector in 2020. Also impacts of recent commodity price shocks and the potential for longer-term reductions in demand for commodities. It's this up-to-date part of the flexible reporting approach that I want to emphasize because it's so important and I think is so aligned with mainstreaming approaches. In the midst of this rapidly evolving crisis that all countries are facing, there is an urgent need for current information about the impact that COVID-19 is having on things like extractive sector licensing, contractual terms, exploration, production, exports, revenues, and employment. And in this respect, the role that EITI actors and structures could play in shedding light on evolving sector developments, on informing strong policy responses to the crisis is more important now than ever before. And flexible reporting creates the opportunity to use EITI processes to facilitate transparency on these key sector shifts that are happening right now. This slide shows the fact sheet on flexible reporting, and I've highlighted some of the kinds of current shifts that countries and companies are encouraged to disclose under the policy. I want to talk about 3 areas of sector shifts in particular that could be covered by flexible reporting. They are shifts in resource dependency, race to the bottom risks, and barriers to energy transition. And I want to talk about these 3 because flexible reporting also offers a unique opportunity to shed light on the shifts in policy and practice that companies and countries are making in response to the crisis, but that also have larger, broader, longer term implications in terms of energy transition. And I know energy transition is of course such an important issue, especially in Latin America. In terms of dependency shifts, one set of highly relevant sector changes that are within the scope of flexible reporting relates to delayed licensing rounds, postponed exploration and development plans, and downward revisions to budget projections based on new break-even oil price assumptions. These types of revisions could indicate that energy transition dynamics stemming from lower oil prices, reduced demand for fossil fuels, and international climate commitments are impacting countries' finances. And depending on the timing and scale of these shifts, that could prompt citizens in some oil-producing countries to need to raise serious questions around, over-dependence on resources and significantly adjusting their expectations about what the sector will actually be able to deliver for them economically. So that's one important set of shifts that I think a mainstreamed flexible reporting approach could be really powerful in addressing. A second set are race to the bottom risks. Kind of conversely to the dependency shifts, incentives requested by or given to companies, things like overly generous tax breaks or bailouts, force majeure relief, reductions in environmental and social protections, these could indicate that actors may be seeking to mitigate energy transition impacts by kind of rushing to push oil projects across the finish line in order to get whatever profits or revenues they can. And while these kind of race to the bottom tactics might seem rational or like a good idea in the short term, the longer term benefits for countries might not outweigh the social, economic, and environmental costs. And it's not just oil. Many mining countries are also experiencing downturns. If the current circumstances accelerate a shift towards renewable energy, then increased activity around strategic minerals could impact mining countries, again, related to the need for even greater transparency and oversight around these shifts. And again, I think flexible reporting with a mainstreamed approach is a great opportunity there. The last kind of category of shift I want to talk about is barriers to transition. So we know that sector shifts to relax regulatory enforcement, reduce oversight of state-owned enterprises, to make exceptional uses of sovereign wealth funds. These could reflect just very practical constraints of countries that are grappling with limited government bandwidth and certainly unprecedented health needs. But in some cases, these same types of shifts could also indicate risks of unscrupulous actors exploiting kind of the chaos of the crisis for corrupt purposes and their own personal gain. So I think similarly, what we're seeing in terms of restrictions on public gatherings, obviously an important essential tool for slowing the spread of the coronavirus, but there have also been serious cause for concerns where such restrictions have actually crossed a line to become impediments to civic space. So capture by vested interest, restrictions on civic space, these too can create barriers to public dialogue and to policy action on energy transition issues. So in general, I think using flexible reporting to disclose information on these types of shifts, especially in a mainstream manner, would be a very powerful contribution to informing sound policy choices and public debate at this critical time. If I can have the next slide, please. I also just want to briefly note that energy transition considerations are, of course, still relevant even for countries not pursuing flexible reporting, but that are interested in mainstreaming or even just in doing traditional EITI reporting. So I wanted to briefly talk about some provisions in the standard that can be relevant to energy transition analysis and debate. One of the biggest challenges with EITI data is that it's often old. It's often backwards looking. On average, EITI data is around 2 years old. But energy transition considerations and so many policy considerations are, of course, forward-looking. That's another important reason that mainstreaming has such an essential role to play here in terms of shifting the time frame that we're talking about with this data. I'd note that there is an existing EITI provision that has an important forward-looking component, and that's this provision on the slide, provision 5.3c, that says MSGs are encouraged to disclose information that will further public understanding and debate around issues of revenue sustainability and resource dependence. So that includes assumptions underpinning budgets that are upcoming, projected production, commodity prices, revenue forecasts, and the proportion of future fiscal revenues expected to come from the extractive sector. That type of information is all critical for a country's longer-term energy transition analysis, and it's all very well suited to a mainstreamed approach, especially integrating this type of transparency on assumptions and forecasts into countries' budget planning processes and production projections in companies' climate risk disclosures. This is a very live discussion in the EITI International Board. We've been discussing it for some time, and we'll discuss next steps at our board meeting next month. I'm hopeful that the EITI standard will evolve to better reflect these absolutely critical energy transition issues, which we in civil society have been pushing for years. But I also want to be clear that MSGs don't have to wait until there's a new version of the standard to start tackling this. There's flexible reporting and provisions like 5.3c that can be leveraged right now because, frankly, these issues are too urgent to wait. If I could have the next slide, please. So I just want to give two kind of more concrete examples going back to this concept of the goal of mainstreaming being to help EITI processes better inform public debate on key issues. And I want to give two examples of how this linkage could work, again, focused on energy transition considerations and using existing EITI requirements. So on this slide, I'm looking at exploration expenditures by national oil companies. And on the left, just really a list of EITI disclosure requirements where mainstreaming could have real potential. So requirements on implementing countries disclosing the role of state enterprises, the implementing countries having to disclose the rules and practices regarding financial relationships between governments and state-owned enterprises, including on reinvestment, expectations around state-owned enterprises needing to disclose their audited financial statements, and countries being encouraged to describe the rules and practices related to SOE operating and capital expenditures. Mainstreaming those types of disclosures and engagement around those types of policies could help inform debates on how NOC roles should evolve, how ambitious should plans be for national oil companies, how are national oil companies using public revenues, how does increased uncertainty about returns on investment impact decisions about how vigorously a national oil company should be pursuing ramping up exploration. I think this is a concrete example of how mainstreaming can really facilitate this better informed debate on really timely issues. If I could have the next slide, please. This one, in a similar vein, and as I mentioned, not just quantitative data, this is an example around licensing and contract terms. Mainstreaming EITI requirements on reforms. Where the government is undertaking legal or fiscal reforms, the MSG is encouraged to ensure that these are documented. Obviously, reform processes are ongoing, very much lend themselves to mainstreaming, and it could help inform debates on whether the government is changing licensing or fiscal policy rules based on perceptions that they're running out of time. Again, this race to the bottom type concern. Another important EITI requirement on deviations between the legal and regulatory framework governing licenses and the actual awards could help inform debates on whether the government is changing practices without formally changing the rules, which could trigger the need for better oversight. An important requirement that definitely lends itself to mainstreaming is the requirement for contracts and licenses granted, entered into, or amended from January 1st of 2021 onward. Again, here, a huge opportunity to monitor race to the bottom risks and broader requirements, about MSGs being able to include additional information on the allocation of licenses. Again, another opportunity to mainstream in a way that could help inform whether, if any, climate scenarios are being utilized in cost-benefit analysis around decisions on new licensing. If I could have the next slide. Just want to very quickly mention that obviously EITI isn't just about disclosures. A big part of EITI's contribution is through outreach, consultation, participation, and civil society engagement in particular. Mainstreaming has the potential to increase civil society's ability to monitor and demand improvements in resource governance, and they would benefit from the more timely and relevant information that would be part of a mainstream approach. But given growing restrictions on civic space, there are also concerns amongst many in civil society that mainstreaming could undermine the multi-stakeholder aspect of EITI. I think the main message here is that mainstreaming can facilitate improved channels for civil society engagement if best practices around outreach, consultation, and participation are also integrated into ongoing policymaking processes and commercial operations. So I go back to my original framing that mainstreaming has to be about integrating EITI's transparency and consultation best practices into the day-to-day operations and systems of entities. In this slide, I've included a link to a report that we did last year on how MSG mainstreaming efforts can address the risks and opportunities related to civil society engagement specifically, so I hope that's of use. If I could have the next slide. Just to give a very quick example of this, a leading example that we often cite of a well-integrated system for data transparency is the Rondas Mexico website, but just wanted to flag that in addition to very well-integrated data, the government in Mexico involved civil society in the design, implementation, and monitoring of disclosures. And there was a civil society monitoring group set up, which helped, met with the government and helped provide feedback on disclosures. And we, between 2016 and 2018, worked with the Hydrocarbon Commission and civil society in Mexico on this. So I think this is just a useful example of linking strong data mainstreaming and strong consultation mainstreaming. If I could have the next slide. And this is the last one. I'll just finish with this kind of visualization about how these different aspects of mainstreaming could offer an opportunity to really refocus the roles of different EITI components. You can see how reporting agencies and companies could start to shift from just responding to annual questionnaires to actually integrating transparency and consultation into their operations. How EITI reports could shift from being places where you just put large amounts of data to instead being opportunities to collate information, address data quality, and provide really rich additional context. And how MSGs could transition from spending time and resources just collecting data to instead assessing the quality of data, facilitating analysis, and most importantly, promoting public understanding and debate. So I'll end there. My email is on the next slide. Happy to answer any questions during the Q&A, and feel free to reach out via email as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. Such a challenging scenario. So thank you very much for your thoughts. For sure, we will be back on some of them when we will be talking about and reflecting on your presentation. Now I want to give the floor to Ms. Vice Minister Carolina Rojas. Good morning again in Bogota. And please, the floor is yours. We are really happy to have you again on board and to have this successful example of Colombia, which is seen as one of the most important examples of EITI implementation in the world. Thank you very much and good morning.
Well, thank you, Victor, for the introduction and also for the support in having this series of webinars. And I'm very happy to be sharing this space today with both Erica and Michael to discuss mainstreaming and the experience of Colombia in these issues. Just let me know if you can see my slides so I can begin my presentation.
Yes, we see it.
Great, thanks.
Please go ahead.
Well,
Thanks.
I'd like to begin by putting a little bit in context why EITI is important for the Colombian extractive sector, and also touching upon some of the issues that Erica just mentioned in her presentation. And it's the fact that EITI is a tool that allows the Colombian extractive sector to show the public around an MSSG framework what the benefits and the role of the extractive sector is for the development of Colombia and for the transformation of Colombia, and how the extractive sector has an important role, which is what I would like to explain in my presentation, and also what this role means in the context of an energy transition, which is a discussion that is very important for all the countries, but it's also very important for Colombia. Just to give you a little bit of context about Colombia, for those who don't know perhaps the details of our country, we are a country that has a strategic location. We have around 45 million inhabitants. Our growth rates and inflation rates were very low. These rates, of course, are pre-pandemic, and of course, we are suffering from economic decline as well as every other country in the world, but we were having a more or less stable economy before COVID-19, and now we are working in a joint effort to bring the economy into these growth rates going forward. We've also had a very important rankings in terms of doing business, and this year we were accepted in the OECD as a new OECD country, reflecting the commitment of the Colombian government and Colombia in general to the best standards in the world in terms of investment and international trade and other issues. In terms of the extractive industry, it's a very important sector for the Colombian economy. Both oil and gas and mining represent around 7% of Colombian GDP, almost a little bit more than half of exports. 34% is FDI, and since 2012, the extractive sector has brought to the country around almost $19 billion in royalties. But in addition to royalties, the Colombian extractive sector, and we have a large SOE, which is Ecopetrol, which is our national petroleum company, and the income provided from other oil and gas and mining companies represent around 12% of the national government revenue, which implies that it's a very important sector in terms of the economic contributions to the country. And most of this revenue comes from oil. I would say around 80% of this revenue comes from oil. And in our mining sector, our main mining product is coal. So both of our main extractive industries sectors are very much related to the energy transition, and part of the discussion that we believe EITI has to bring to the table, and I think Erica mentioned it in a lot of detail in her presentation, is what are the transitions for countries that have this kind of participation of the extractive industries in their economies and in their revenues. Just before I go more into detail in EITI, with respect to mining, one of our strategies has been exactly to try to diversify our mining sector towards mining products that are more related to the energy transition, metals, copper, gold, and other elements that are more aligned with this climate change, energy transition discussion, and having transparency with the EITI in this discussion is essential. In terms of the right to access information, just to give you a general context, Colombia has a legal framework that recognizes this as a fundamental right, both in its constitution and in different legislations, and it is part of our regulation, but also part of our spirit to have a public dialogue that strengthens civil society, and it's a tool to fight against corruption that guarantees participation, transparency, evidence-based decision-making, and builds trust within stakeholders. And the Colombian extractive industry has been very much committed to this transparency and open data agenda. And in the last few years, there have been developments in terms of public information platforms that provide the context of how the extractive industries work in Colombia. In terms of the mining sector, for example, this year, the new Colombian online cadastre called Ana Minería was launched. It has a public access towards all of the mining, licensing, contracts, and also all of the environmental information that is related with these mining projects is available online for all of the stakeholders. We also have an online registry of our artisanal miners, which are an important part of our mining sector. In terms of oil, our national oil and gas agency has a land map with all of the areas that are subject to exploration and exploitation. We also have an online oil and gas technical information repository that is also public, and the mining sector is also working with the Colombian Geological Service in a mining repository of information that we hope will be launched next year. And in terms of the use of the revenues that the extractive industry provides, we have also a platform that shows the investments of those revenues that is a part of the National Planning Agency that has an online registration of projects financed with royalties from the extractive sector. So we have a series of different platforms in the extractive sector that show transparency, that have open data, and that are available for all of the interested parties. And in terms of other more productive sectors, the Colombian extractive sector is one of the leading sectors in terms of transparent information within the Colombian economy, as can be seen with all of these different platforms that are available. So what is the role exactly of the AITI in all of this context? So in addition to those platforms that I have already mentioned, since 2013, Colombia has engaged in implementing the AITI standard, and we have been constantly progressing and making our AITI reporting more sophisticated, with, of course, under the guidance of our MSG. And for example, we have passed from 2013 to having 4 criteria that were being reported to almost 68 criteria that we are reporting in 2019, of course, following the standard, but also leading how these criteria are being reported around the world. And this criteria right now includes reporting on contributions, that includes all royalties, taxes, and other compensations that the extractive industry has in Colombia, which amounts to around $32 billion, $33 billion in the last 5 years. We also have been, for the last few years, including information with regards to job creation with a gender perspective. We have included subnational payments that are very important in addition to royalties in the Colombian institutional framework, social investments, both voluntary and obligatory, that amount almost to $100 million in total, and environmental payments. This is just a very quick glance of the different types of things that we are reporting in our EITI standard, and that show the commitment of the Colombian MSG in being transparent and including more information to enable to have a good policy conversation based on this information. And going into mainstreaming, we have been pioneering a lot of mainstreaming and new dashboards and more sources of information within our EITI standard reporting. I have some examples here. We have georeferenced information both in the mining and the oil and gas sector. We have information by company, by different types of minerals, by municipality, by provinces, in the different years where information is available. We have been working on online information so that the consolidation of this information is quicker and more mainstream every day. And also this year, something that also Erica mentioned and that I couldn't agree more, usually EITI standards and EITI reporting has a large lag. One of our objectives this year, we usually report our EITI standard with a 1-year lag. Our goal this year was to decrease that time by at least 6 months. Unfortunately, with the COVID pandemic, some of our processes were were delayed, but we have already finished our 2019 reporting. We had our MSG meeting this week. So for the first time, we're going to have our EITI 2019 report available by next week, which is 9 months after the closure. And our goal next year is to have it even more quicker next year, and also to relate some of the things that Erica was mentioning, to have more quarterly reports updating some of the information so that it's available in a more timely manner. And all of this information, you can see it in the EITI Colombia website. And this is also reflected in how our information from our EITI reports is being used. We have been increasing substantial visits to our website, almost 500% just this year, and from different countries. And what is more important is that we're seeing how the information is being taken to public debates of different kinds. We were, for example, last week with the minister in a debate with the civil society, a civil society organization that engages a lot of environmental organizations in the country. And part of the information that was used in the debate was coming from the EITI reporting. And that is exactly the kind of things that we believe from the government's perspective should be how the EITI standards should be being used going forward. And this effort that Colombia has been doing has been recognized by the EITI Secretariat. We have a satisfactory progress recognized in 2018, which is the highest validation in Latin America. And in last year's conference in Paris, the EITI chair recognized Colombia in its leadership in mainstreaming and resourcefulness in implementing EITI, something that is continuously progressing, and we are continuously working towards that. But I think perhaps our discussions internally and our biggest challenge is how do you take this information to discussions at the local level? And I'm going back to my comment at the beginning. What's important for us is to have a clear and transparent conversation of the different possibilities that the extractive sector has for the Colombian development, what the challenges are, for example, in the context of an energy transition, and that those discussions have to go at the local level. And so there's a big challenge of how to bring this information to increase accessibility and usability of this information at the local level, to promote the data analysis. As I mentioned, it's very encouraging that debates are already using this information at the national level, but we have to bring that information at the local level, make it more accessible, more technical. The extractive industries in general is a very difficult industry to explain in a simple manner. And I think that is a challenge not only for Colombia, but for every country that has an important extractive sector, to be able to bring that information to the most simple terms so that information is understood by those who have the impacts of the extractive industry at their local levels. Of course, under the premise that information has to be totally reliable. I think in Colombia we have a good sense that the information is reliable. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but we have a very good kind of information, and we're doing it in a systematic way, which is very important. And all of this is very important for the Colombian policy, because we have just finished reforming our entire royalty system. The reform, in essence, what it brings is more resources for producing areas and gives more independence and autonomy for local governments to use those resources. And so the role of a civil society of looking at those investments in the most transparent way becomes essential. And we are certain that EITI is going to be very important for that discussion. Actually, in this government, we did an internal reform at the ministry to join the royalties group with the EITI group, because we are convinced that both things have to come together. And it's a discussion that we've been having at the EIT Secretariat. We strongly believe that the EITI has to evolve into having more deep discussions of how the extractive industries revenues are actually used and actually become a development for countries or not under a transparent a framework such as what the EITI provides. So basically, this is what we wanted to show with regards to Colombia. Just a quote from a recent report, no, not so recent, but a report from Deloitte in terms of indicating that the mining sector should be based on information. And I think mainstreaming and EITI is an innovation in the extractive sectors, but that innovation has to become successful and deliver value for those interested parties in our case, most importantly at the subnational level where things are actually happening and things take place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Minister. Very good presentation, and as usual, giving us some of your thoughts and your advances in Colombia in the EITI implementation, and not only in the EITI implementation, but in this big transformation of all the extractive industry in Colombia. So thank you very much. Always a pleasure to have you in this webinar series. And also there's a lot of good questions coming from the audience. We will be back in that later, but please feel free to ask your questions. We will try to address many as possible. And now we will cross the Atlantic and go to the United Kingdom. I welcome Mr. Michael Nash to give their thoughts and experience in the mainstreaming issues in the EITI United Kingdom Secretariat. So Michael, you're welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today. And the floor is yours. Michael, I think your microphone is mute.
Sorry, thank you, Victor, and thank you to the previous speakers. There were some really interesting points that came out from both presentations, which I'm sure we can sort of discuss further, and there'll be questions about that sort of later on. I just thought now, good morning everyone, it's actually afternoon here in the UK. I'd just like to thank everyone, or thank you all for very much for joining this webinar. And actually, it's because of connection issues, unfortunately you only get the audio and the actual slides rather than seeing me. I'll just give you a quick bit of background about myself. I'm Mike Nash. I'm currently working at the UK EITI Secretariat based in London. The Secretariat located at the UK's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I've worked at BEIS and its previous incarnations. People might know Department of Trade and Industry, DTI, Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, BIS, since 1984, and I've been working on EITI matters since 2016. Thank you very much for providing me with the opportunity to take part in this webinar, as I said earlier on mainstreaming, and provide you with a flavour of the work we're doing in the UK and where we are in terms of EITI mainstreaming. I can't claim to be an expert on the subject, but I hope my presentation will set out context for the audience on where we are in the UK in terms of EITI. I thought probably best to start with just where we are in terms of setting the scene, where in terms of milestones for the UK EITI. In May 2013, former Prime Minister David Cameron announced UK's commitment to EITI. In July 2013, we formed the first UK EITI MSG to oversee implementation of EITI, and they held their first meeting in October 2013. So we're talking seven years ago now. So we've been going a few years. We actually only became a candidate country in October 2014. So that's 6 years. and our first report wasn't published until April 2016, and that was actually payments for 2014. So we were a little bit behind in terms of timing of publishing our data. In July 2018, we were validated by the International Secretariat, looking at the implementation of EITI in the UK, and by November we had our final, November 2019, so it took a little while. By 2019 November we had our final validation report, and we were given meaningful progress in the implementation of the 2016 standard. With the validation report itself came a number of corrective actions that the MSG have been addressing over the last year or so, and we hope that we'll be revalidated by the end of this year, once we're sort of satisfied that we have addressed the corrective actions that were put in front of us. And we're aiming, very much like Columbia, who got it, I think, who now have satisfactory progress, we're aiming for that in this validation, hopefully at the end of this year. Our fifth report, which was the last report we published, came out at the end of last year in December, and in May this year we launched a new UK EITI website, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on in the presentation. We're hoping to publish our next data for 2019 in October, November time, which you can see now that between the actual data being published or being available and us publishing it is getting a little bit closer. We'd hope that, obviously with mainstreaming, eventually we will be able to publish the data as soon as it's available, but that's obviously something a little bit down the line. New slide, please. Right. As we know, EITI participating countries have been encouraged to explore the extent to which the EITI standard can be achieved through systematic disclosure or mainstreaming. As we know, there's not much difference between both phrases, and it's still quite a complicated phrase, I think, to get people's heads around. With this in mind, the MSG approved the commission of a scoping study to examine the possibilities of mainstreaming in the UK. The terms of reference for the study, based closely on the template developed by the EITI's International Board and Secretariat, were drawn up, and a study was conducted by the analysts within the BEIS, which is the department where I work, and a final version of the study was put in front of the MSG in January 2019, and this was approved by the MSG. This study had a number of recommendations about mainstreaming for the UK, and I'll go on and talk a little bit more about that in a second. Next slide, please. UK implementation of the EITI standard requires the disclosure of non-revenue information under 6 main categories: legal frameworks and fiscal regimes, licence allocation frameworks and registers of licences, company beneficial ownership, exploration, production and exports, revenue management, distribution and transfers, and contribution of the sector to the UK economy. The study found that most of this contextual information is routinely disclosed on public online sources, but not all of this information is accessible to the end user, as available sources are quite dispersed. This is primarily due to the fragmented nature of the UK extractive sector and a number of regulators and industry bodies involved in the operation. While some gaps exist in the available information, most can be addressed with relative ease over a short or medium-term period. Some contextual information requirements can, however, be mainstreamed fairly quickly. We set up a mainstreaming subgroup set up with our MSG members to consider the implementation of the recommendations of the study in more detail. The mainstreaming subgroup drew up an action plan based on the recommendations of the study to divided the actions from the study and the recommendations into sort of things that we thought were quick wins, where we thought we could do this quite quickly and without too much fuss, and a number of the issues we actually looked at and thought they were probably longer term issues. So we looked at those and we thought these are going to take a little bit longer, and we've divided those up so that we know in terms of where we are and how long some of these issues will take to sort of address. The quick wins were mostly adding sort of specific text and data and links to existing websites. So, for example, the UK has information on subnational transfers, which is transfers between the devolved administrations, i.e. the UK and Northern Ireland on rights for the UK continental shelf. So they are allowed access to certain funds for that, and the UK takes in the funds and then pays the Northern Ireland their percentage share of those costs. We also have longer term issues which are more complex in nature and will take longer to address and implement. The main one is something that came out was mainstreaming and reconciliation of tax payments, which is quite a big sort of issue in the UK with tax confidentiality. It's something that the MSG are currently looking at quite closely to see how we can address it, and it's something that we're still looking at, and it's still causing a few not problems, but it's not straightforward. The full study and terms of reference are available on the UK EITR website, which will be available on these slides if these slides are actually sent round. But it's www.ukEITI.org if people can remember that. And this mainstreaming work actually quite nicely dovetailed with the work on the website. So if you could change the slide, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, there's a screenshot of our website. Believe me, even though it probably needs a little bit of improvement, the original website was not great, so it's a great improvement on that. This was launched in May 2020. As I say, the original website was housed on a government website and didn't really fit in with the nature and independence of the MSG in terms of, it's an independent group and their website is on a government website, so it didn't really sit well with the MSG. So we looked into the possibility of having an independent website. We actually had to get permission from, because it was already housed on a government website, I had to get permission from our Cabinet Office, and we did actually receive that permission to set up an independent website. If you could change slide, please. Thank you. The website includes sector background and information on oil and gas and the mining and quarrying industries in the UK. It hosts all the UK EITI publications and reports, including minutes, the annual reports, the feasibility study we've just spoken about, open data, our comms strategy. It also has a news and events section where we recently announced our new UKI UK EITI champion, which was Lord Callanan. And it also includes the reporting templates and guidance for companies who report under EITI. So there's a one-stop shop for them, and there's guidance on how to fill out the forms. So that's available as well. And also, obviously, the reconciliation data is also available under the reports and publications area, and we plan to make sure that this is actually published as on the website as soon as it's available and reconciled, hopefully in the autumn, which is much quicker than we've had in the past because we've had to rely on other people to update the website. We can actually update the website ourselves. And there's also, which hopefully you'll all be quite interested, there's also a section on beneficial ownership. Next slide, please. At the G8 Summit in 2013, the UK government committed to take action to increase the transparency of company ownership and control and announced the creation of a public UK company beneficial ownership register. Next slide, please. It's called the People with Significant Control Register and was implemented in 2016. The PSE register became the first public accessible company beneficial ownership register in the G20 and one of the first in the world. It now contains more than 4.9 million names of people with significant control over UK registered companies in all sectors of the economy, and the information is viewed by national and international stakeholders over 500,000 times a month. The information is public and free to access alongside core company information from the UK's Companies House, and there's no requirements to sign up for a service. We think this is a pretty good example of systematic disclosure, and more information can be on the PSE register can be found on the UK EITI website under the beneficial ownership section. Next slide, please. And just finally, this is our small team. Nicola Wallace is the UK National Coordinator, and there's myself. You can find our contact details on the website. I'll just say thank you for listening. I hope my presentation provided you with some insight into our work on mainstream in the UK and also our EITI work in general. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. As usual, very good presentation and interesting questions will arise, especially and particularly in the beneficial ownership issues, which is big questions for many countries. So we will be back later in that. I would like to ask and request the panelists if they can turn on their cameras for this Q&A session. Thank you very much. Well, thanks for sharing your experiences and your thoughts. And this has been a really, really interesting discussion. And now I would like to start with a question that usually arises when we think about the cost of the EITI implementation. And one of the most expenses is the work of the independent administrator. So the idea with this mainstreaming idea is try to have lower cost and automated data collection. But on the other hand, you have this figure of the independent administrator as a point of trust for all the NSG. So what are your thoughts about that, and how can we balance this apparent necessity of having a third-party auditor, which makes and introduce this idea of trust in the process, but on the other hand, there's a lot of technological advance and better cost can be achieved. So maybe you can start maybe with Erica, please.
Sure, yeah, no, and it's definitely, I think, one of the real kind of practical but important questions that arises in these considerations. On the cost component, I think first of all, there is analysis that's been done. The International Secretariat kind of has done analysis trying to get a better handle on kind of what the cost implications actually are. But I do have, and I think it will vary on a country by country and kind of disclosure type by disclosure type basis, probably. What I could imagine is a scenario where, as you said, if part of it is kind of automation, there might be an initial upfront cost that's higher to build the process for collection or build the expertise in the relevant, government agency or what have you, or the actual data platform itself. But then the hope is that once you've made that initial upfront cost, then over time you can utilize it for a long time, and you've just made it that one-time investment really in something that has ongoing value. I also think another way of thinking about the cost in terms of mainstreaming is that as these disclosures become more deeply integrated, it's in a way it's about spreading the cost, right? Spreading the cost to the many actors who are involved in producing this information and using this information and trying to communicate with other stakeholders. So I think that's another way of thinking about it. In terms of the actual kind of data quality, reconciliation, independence component, I think for an individual, I'm not saying this is a kind of a board policy position, but to think about it pragmatically from a country perspective, I think there's some logic to sort of a risk-based approach. If you've never had a, discrepancy in any of your reconciliation, payments in versus revenues, payments made versus revenues received, or never had a significant discrepancy, I think that's part of what an application around that component of mainstreaming would say and demonstrate and say, look, this doesn't appear to be an area where there's significant risk for us, but there might be other areas like the EITI requirement around deviations in license disclosures where actually there are discrepancies between what the rules on licensing are and how licenses are actually being allocated, where it might actually make more sense to invest time with oversight on that element. So to me, taking a risk-based approach, focusing on the areas where it seems like the MSG has determined there is more concern or more oversight is needed, could be a way to sort of prioritize on where you make that investment.
Thank you, Erica. Vice Minister, please.
Yes, thank you, Victor. And I think Erica touches upon many issues that we have internally thought regarding the cost of the external auditor. I agree with you, Victor, in the sense that, especially at the beginning, the external auditor is essential to build the trust between the parties who are part of the MSG and in the whole process in general. And there's like an initial cost of understanding where the information is, which probably starts decreasing in time. So at the beginning, I think it's very important, but I do think that once a country already has its information and its mainstreaming and its disclosure in place, I think either the auditing has to go into specific issues, or as Erica mentioned, and it's something that we have been considering internally, maybe the cost of the auditing should be spread amongst other members of the MSG. But I am personally a true believer in strengthening country systems. And I think what the ultimate goal has to be that there is trust on the public institutions that create information and the public institutions that have auditing agencies. For example, in Colombia, we have different agencies that do auditing in general. And I think strengthening those country systems is the way to go. And one this year was a very good example of how I think the EITI has to migrate to either spreading the cost, reducing it, or going to country systems, because I am also part of the EITI board, and I represent the countries from the Latin American region. And during COVID, one of the main concerns was who was going to pay for the whole EITI process. And in the scenario of decreasing public revenues and economic downturn, will priorities change? There are more, there are less resources and a lot of needs that have emerged in the context of the crisis, and perhaps EITI auditing is not going to be a priority for all of the countries. So I think this specific context has shown us that it's important to have this conversation regarding trusting country systems where it's possible. I think there's something to say in terms of beginning the EITI process with this external auditing and external validator. But as a country becomes more sophisticated, I think there is a conversation to be had of either sharing the costs with other MSG members or doing mainstreaming so that country systems are used more so that the process is sustainable over time.
Thank you very much, Vice Minister. Michael, please.
Yes. I'll get back on the camera. Yeah, I've sort of jotted down a few sort of pros and cons in terms of, yeah, they're very good to have, but I think it depends on the circumstances of the country. If they're needed, yeah, if there's a sort of perceived corruption sort of in a particular country, perhaps we do need something like that. But I've jotted down a few little things. The cons are there's a lack of pre-publication checks on the data, which inevitably mismatches occur, and is this sort of good? Does this give the good impression? If the mismatches aren't looked at in deeper and sort of resolved, does this give people the wrong impression of the data that's coming through? We rely quite a lot on the IA to sort of make sure that these mismatches are actually resolved. The data is probably less accurate. The MSG and or the IA would need to sort of provide sort of commentary and analysis on why the data is not quite as accurate. I don't think there's any real admin burden reduction for government agencies. This data is already sort of produced. It will still have to be commissioned, so there's no real sort of change in terms of for the government side, because that data will still be needed. And will it be published any quicker? Possibly by a couple of months. Other than sort of internal government agency check, data wouldn't be subject to any audit or assurance. And pros, of course, there are some pros. Having said that, sometimes the costs involved in an IA are quite prohibitive. They're not cheap. So it's not every country that might have the sort of resources or the budget to actually pay for this. And obviously, there are areas where certain countries are perhaps not as transparent as others, and the IA is probably quite important in those sort of countries, rather than rely on the government agencies to report the data.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Maybe we can let all the cameras on so we can face the discussion. Thank you. And yes, you all touch a very interesting point, and it is, yes, it depends on the country profile, on the national context, and so on. The crisis also gives us new challenges where the EITI implementation maybe is not at the top of the priorities given the necessities of many people in the world. And I would like to ask your opinion on, for the smaller countries, and how to face these requirements of the EITI implementation that are more complex more and more. and now you have this other situation that more needs will arise. Maybe in your opinion and in your experience, you can give some advices in that way. Michael, I think you're muted.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Victor. I think what we've been doing is just looking to build on sort of existing data and systems that are available. There's lots of information out there that can be used. It's tapping into it. It's actually finding where it is and tapping into it, and that doesn't really cost a great deal. It's really been sort of organised in that way and knowing where the data is and using the MSG and using civil society, using government and using industry to tap into this sort of data. It's a lot of this data is already available on websites. So you can either use, if you've got an existing website, to highlight that data or links. We seem to be doing quite a lot of links on our website at the moment to the sort of data that people will need, and that's sort of my sort of thought is that if a little bit of research and using your stakeholders, I'm sure there's lots of information out there that is available that you can use. There's also we also sort of looked at is we know, as I said earlier on, the IA can be quite costly. So we've sort of looked at, but we haven't gone much further, is actually looking at mainstreaming data, especially reconciliation data, unilaterally. This probably won't work for everywhere, as I said before, but that's sort of something that we could sort of consider in the future. They're the only really points I've got on that one, Victor. I don't know if that's okay.
Thank you.
Perhaps I can comment a little bit on that. I think, as I mentioned in my previous answer, there is an upfront cost of getting all your systems in place, understanding where the information is and the like. But I think that once you've reached like a certain threshold, it's more a question of what the country and the MSG wants to do with EITI, and what is the marginal return of compliance of every single point of the standard. And the standard is becoming very detailed and sophisticated as we go forward. But every piece of information, additional information that is required, implies costs, and what is the marginal return of making that effort versus what your objectives with the EITI are. I think in Colombia, our discussion, or from the government's perspective at least, has been we have reached a threshold of identifying what the economic contributions of the sector are, and we have been exploring these other contributions in terms of environmental contributions and in terms of describing the sector. But I think in our case specifically, we are now more concerned of how we bring that information to the public, to civil society at the local level, and how that information informs discussions regarding how royalties and how economic contributions of the extractive sector actually become progress and development for regions in terms of different projects, investments, public works, and the like, where there's a lot of things that we need to be doing, and that I think that is our own personal objective. But I think it depends on what the country wants to do with EITI and where the threshold of continuing to have this information is, and the cost-benefit analysis of that decision is very much an independent and a particular decision of every single country.
Yep, and if I could just add very quickly, completely agree with everything that Carolina and Michael have said. I think the other concept that might be relevant here is a lot of the EITI provisions have this concept of materiality built into them, and that materiality judgment is one that lies with the multi-stakeholder group. And I'm not trying to in any way suggest that that an MSG should use this as kind of a loophole to get around disclosing information on something that really is critical. Not that anyone would do that, but there is quite a bit of scope for multi-stakeholder groups to determine where they draw that threshold of materiality, and if something really just doesn't reach the level of importance that it would fall within kind of a reasonable scope of materiality, that's something that doesn't necessarily need to be included because it hasn't reached that threshold. So there are some kind of, there's flexibility in the EITI standard to make those kinds of adjustments on a lot of elements.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. And speaking about the complexity of the standard and going more and more technical, there comes other issue to be addressed. We were talking about in our last webinar about how to go with the data at the subnational level, where maybe the capacities are different, the understanding is different, and so on. And the Vice Minister Carolina said something really interesting in her presentation about how to show in a less technical way some very technical aspects of the resource governance. So I don't know how you see and what would be good advices for facing this challenge.
Could I just, from my point, if I'm getting the point right, from our point of view, we find it quite difficult to engage an audience on EITI in terms of the UK, and anything that makes it simpler, more interesting for them, and more personal to them, has got to work. That is one of our main problems, is that people, unless you're in the industry, people aren't really that interested in a lot of the things that we're doing. We need to raise the bar, and I know that our civil society are very sort of keen to make it more EITI, what's happening now in the oil and gas industry, what's happening now in mining and quarrying, rather than what happened a year ago in payments, because people just won't be interested in it. But they need to know, and it was interesting that, we need to, I think Erica was talking about, we've got nothing on our website about the effect of COVID-19 on the industry in the UK. We should be having that. I'm going to take that back with me, because that's, if we've got the website, we need to make sure that it's up to date and relevant, not figures from 2018, which people, and the next lot will be 2019, which is last year. So we need something, and we have got things on energy transition, which is very important, and that's very up to date. But the COVID-19, we've sort of missed that a little bit, and I think we need to make sure that anything we do is relevant and engages the public. That's my sort of view on that.
I think that this is a problem of the extractive industries in general. And EITI is a very specific niche thing that only certain people understand. So I think that's why I think you have to go like backwards in terms of going to at the local level and explain how the extractive sector can transform the lives of those people who are at the local level, with the public works that should be financed with these resources. I think maybe this is something very particular of Colombia, because most of the revenues in Colombia are assigned and invested by local governments. So that's why I always insist on this local level perspective. But showing them those public works, or the lack there of those public works, is going to entice that conversation of where those resources come from and how you can link those public works to those companies who are working at the local level, and make all of them accountable, both the government, but also the company making the correct payments in the discussion, and also having a very also difficult conversation of explaining at the local level the different roles that the government has versus what is the responsibility of companies in terms of social responsibility or ESG in general. So I think that it's much easier to say than do it, but just to link public works with the extractive sector is a very big challenge, but I think that's the way to go, so that you can go back to that accountability of the companies with the payments that are have to be done according to your own legislation.
Thank you, Vice Minister.
And I just very briefly add, again, completely agreeing that I almost sometimes think we're too hard on ourselves in terms of how directly linked at local level we expect EITI data to be. And that is, I think sometimes a longer chain of kind of use of the data is more realistic and just as okay if EITI data is elevating the level of media coverage in an informed way around what's happening in the sector, if it is elevating the level of, you know, capital-based civil society who might also have linkages with more grassroots communities, if all of that is becoming stronger and more dynamic and better informed, then it is, I think, ultimately reaching that level, just maybe not in the way that sometimes we envision kind of at community level, like direct engagement with the data, which just might not be realistic, but doesn't mean that the information and the analysis and the findings and implications aren't reaching the local level. So I think that's another way to think about it too.
Okay, thank you very much. We are almost running out of time, unfortunately, and as usual, but I would like to make a straight question to Michael and take advantage of having two board members of this famous 2.6 requirement on beneficial ownership. Michael, how was your experience implementing that requirement?
It's not actually part of my remit. My colleagues at the same department have been working on that since 2013 or 2016. I can't quite remember. It's their sort of side of the house. I think it's been very successful. They do tours around the world, basically, sort of telling people about how they set it up, and it's a very nice job because they get to one or two quite nice places rather than being stuck in London. But yeah, I mean, if you have any specific beneficial ownership questions from the audience, please make sure they're sent to me, and I can then sort of make sure that they're, but unfortunately I'm not an expert on it. It's my colleagues who actually deal with the beneficial ownership aspects of the work.
Okay, great.
So I'm sorry, it's a bit of a answer.
No problem, thank you. Maybe you have some thoughts about that? Erica or Carolina?
Yeah, sure. No, it is an issue that I work on quite a lot and that NRJI works on. I mean, I think the beneficial ownership requirement is the perfect example of non-quantitative mainstreaming opportunity. The way that the EITI beneficial ownership disclosure requirement is framed is around disclosing beneficial ownership and politically exposed person information for companies that hold and have been assigned extractive licenses. So that's a direct link to a natural integrated process of licensing that happens regularly, renewing licenses, reviewing licenses, allocating new licenses, and integrating that collection of beneficial ownership information, the screening of beneficial ownership information for potential conflict of interest risks at the licensing moment is, to me, a way to make that requirement, one, less daunting, because it's part of a moment when government agencies are already collecting information about applicants for licenses, and a way to make it much more useful because we know there are high conflict of interest and corruption risk factors at the moment of licensing, and actually being able to collect and use that information in an integrated process could have huge value add. So I don't want to, in any, there are of course many countries have worked on kind of the legal provisions and getting the wording right. We actually have a briefing on our website specifically with draft template legal provisions that countries can consider integrating and customizing for their own needs, in addition to screening elements also draft legal provisions on that. So there's certainly work to be done, but I think it's just a textbook case for the importance of taking a mainstreamed approach in a way that could actually lower your cost and increase the value.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also think that this is a perfect example of how these requirements have to adapt to the realities of each country. We have laws that require beneficial ownership not only for the extractive industries but for other industries. But because we've had a history of conflict and of other issues, our approach is to have private listings that are available in the case that they are needed in order to protect the privacy of some of the members. But we're in the process, and just to like share that each country has its own circumstances that have to be taken into account when including these types of or implementing these types of requirements that the AITI has.
Vice Minister Carolina, Erica, Michael, thank you very much. This has been a really, really exciting webinar. And my pleasure to have you on board, and just thank you very much. For all in the audience, thank you very much for attending. This webinar series continues. In 2 weeks, we will be talking about gender equality in the extractive sector. So I hope to see you there. Thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Victor. Bye, Michael. Bye, Erica. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.